My name is Jessica, and I was 16 when my stepmother attempted to literally delete me from the family. What started as a subtle exclusion escalated into an orchestrated campaign to make me disappear entirely from their perfect suburban life in Phoenix, Arizona. But sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that even the most calculated manipulator can't anticipate. Before I dive into how my stepmother's scheme spectacularly backfired and led to the most shocking family revelation of my life, let me know where you're reading from. And please upvote if you want to hear how this story ends. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what happened when they returned from their family vacation to find all evidence of my existence completely gone. The foundation of my childhood. Growing up as Jessica Martinez in Phoenix, Arizona, my early memories were painted in the warm hues of desert sunsets and the comforting routine of a typical middle-class family. My parents, Michael and Sandra, seemed like any other young couple navigating the challenges of parenthood in the early 2000s. Dad worked as an electrician for a small family-owned company, often coming home with calloused hands and stories of complicated wiring jobs in the sprawling suburban developments that were transforming the Phoenix landscape. Mom stayed home during my early years, creating a world that revolved around playground visits, library story times, and elaborate art projects that would cover our refrigerator in colorful chaos. Our house was small but filled with laughter, Spanish music from my grandmother's frequent visits, and the smell of my father's weekend barbacoa that would draw neighbors over for impromptu gatherings. Those early years established my understanding of family as something warm, inclusive, and unconditional. Dad would carry me on his shoulders during walks around the neighborhood, pointing out different types of cacti and teaching me to identify the calls of various desert birds. Mom would spend hours braiding my long, dark hair while telling me stories about her childhood in Tucson, weaving tales of family traditions and cultural pride that made me feel connected to something larger than myself. The cracks in this foundation began subtly when I was around 6 years old. Arguments between my parents started happening behind closed doors, their voices becoming hushed and tense whenever I entered a room. The easy laughter that had characterized our family dinners was replaced by polite conversation and uncomfortable silences. Even as a child, I could sense the shift in emotional temperature, though I lacked the vocabulary to articulate what was changing. The divorce and its immediate aftermath. When my parents finally sat me down on our worn leather couch to explain their decision to divorce, I was 7 years old and already intuiting that our family structure was unraveling. They used all the standard phrases designed to reassure children. This isn't your fault. We both love you very much. Some things between grown-ups just don't work out. But beneath their careful words, I detected relief in my mother's voice and resignation in my father's. The practical arrangements were explained with the efficiency of adults who wanted to minimize drama. I would live primarily with Mom in our family home, spending every other weekend and alternating holidays with Dad in his new apartment across town. They presented this as an adventure, an opportunity to have 2 different homes with unique experiences in each location. My mother's transition into single parenthood was marked by a fierce determination to maintain our standard of living despite the reduced household income. She took a job as a receptionist at a dermatology office, working long hours while I attended after-school programs and spent summers at day camps. The financial strain was evident in subtle ways, generic brands replacing name brands at the grocery store, family restaurant visits becoming rare treats, and my mother's frequent reviewing of bills with a calculator and worried expression. Despite these challenges, there was something peaceful about our simplified household. Without the underlying tension that had characterized my parents' final years together, Mom and I developed our own rhythms and traditions. She would help me with homework at the kitchen table while preparing dinner, and we would spend Sunday mornings reading together on the couch, sharing a blanket and taking turns reading chapters aloud from age-appropriate novels. My relationship with my father during this period was complicated by logistics and his own emotional processing of the divorce. His new apartment was sparse and clearly temporary, furnished with mismatched pieces from thrift stores and lacking the personal touches that make a space feel like home. Our weekend visits often involved activities outside the apartment, trips to the zoo, movie theaters, or hiking trails in the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, as if Dad was uncertain how to create meaningful time together within his limited living space. The introduction of David Chen. 2 years after the divorce, when I was 9 years old, my mother began mentioning a man named David Chen with increasing frequency. He was a client at the dermatology office where she worked, a successful real estate developer who specialized in luxury residential projects throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. Mom's descriptions of their initial interactions painted him as charming, attentive, and notably different from the working-class men she had typically dated. David's background was impressive by any standard. He had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan as a teenager, worked his way through Arizona State University with a combination of academic scholarships and restaurant jobs, and built his real estate empire through careful market analysis and strategic partnerships. By the time he met my mother, he was worth several $1 million and owned properties throughout Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, and the more affluent areas of Phoenix. The progression of their relationship was swift, and from my perspective as a 9-year-old, somewhat overwhelming. Within 3 months of their first date, David was a regular presence in our home, bringing expensive bouquets of flowers for my mother and age-appropriate gifts for me that demonstrated both thoughtfulness and significant financial resources. He replaced our aging washing machine without being asked, quietly paid for repairs to my mother's car, and began suggesting activities for all 3 of us that were far beyond our usual budget. David's courtship of my mother was sophisticated and comprehensive. He took her to restaurants featured in Phoenix Magazine, introduced her to cultural events like Phoenix Symphony performances and art gallery openings, and gradually expanded her social circle to include his business associates and their wives. I watched my mother transform during this period, her confidence growing alongside her expanding wardrobe and more polished appearance. The changes weren't entirely positive from my perspective. My mother began asking me to be extra good when David was around, to use my best manners, and to avoid behaviors that might seem childish or demanding. Family time that had previously included just mom and me now often featured David as a central figure, with conversations shifting to topics about which I had no knowledge or opinions. I found myself becoming quieter during these interactions, sensing that my role was to be pleasant and unobtrusive rather than actively engaged. Meeting the Chen children. 6 months into my mother's relationship with David, I was introduced to his children from his previous marriage, Tyler, who was 14, and Sophia, who was 12. Their mother, David explained, lived in San Diego with her new husband, and the children spent summers and alternating holidays with their father in Phoenix. The initial meeting was arranged as a casual barbecue at David's house in Paradise Valley, a sprawling ranch-style home with professional landscaping and a resort-style backyard, complete with a large swimming pool, spa, and outdoor kitchen. The house was easily 4 times the size of our modest home, filled with expensive furniture and artwork that created an atmosphere of careful curation rather than lived-in comfort. Tyler and Sophia were polite but distant during that first meeting, clearly accustomed to adult expectations for good behavior, but lacking genuine warmth toward me. Tyler was already showing signs of the athletic build that would later make him a star lacrosse player, tall for his age with the easy confidence of a child who had never questioned his place in the world. Sophia was delicate and precise in her movements, already demonstrating the discipline that would characterize her gymnastics career. Both children spoke with the refined articulation of private school education, using vocabulary and references that highlighted the cultural gap between their upbringing and mine. When Tyler mentioned his lacrosse team's recent tournament in San Diego, I had no framework for understanding the significance of the event or the social dynamics he described. When Sophia discussed her gymnastics coach's connections to Olympic training programs, her casual mention of national-level competition revealed a world of opportunities that seemed impossibly distant from my own recreational sports experiences. The economic disparities were immediately apparent, but not explicitly discussed. Tyler and Sophia's casual relationship with luxury, their expectation that pools, professional landscaping, and expensive sports equipment were normal parts of childhood, created an unspoken hierarchy that positioned me as the outsider, needing to adapt to their standards rather than the other way around. The engagement and wedding planning. David proposed to my mother on Valentine's Day when I was 10 years old, presenting her with a diamond ring, so large it seemed almost comical on her work-worn hands. The proposal took place at the Four Seasons Resort Scottsdale, during a weekend getaway that I learned about only after their return, when they shared the news with barely contained excitement. The wedding planning process that followed revealed the full extent of David's wealth and social aspirations. No detail was considered too small or too expensive for their celebration. They hired a wedding planner who specialized in luxury intimate gatherings, selected a venue at the Phoenix Art Museum, and crafted a guest list that included David's business partners, their wives, and various civic leaders from Phoenix's social scene. My role in the wedding was carefully considered, but ultimately peripheral. I would serve as a flower girl, wearing a dress selected by David's wedding planner to complement the overall aesthetic, rather than my personal preferences. The dress was beautiful, pale pink silk with hand-sewn beadwork, but the fitting sessions felt like costume preparations for a performance in which I was a minor character, rather than a family member celebrating a significant milestone. The wedding itself was a study in controlled elegance. Every element, from the string quartet playing during the ceremony to the carefully curated menu featuring locally sourced ingredients, spoke to David's desire to make a sophisticated impression on his professional and social contacts. I performed my flower girl duties competently, walking down the aisle with practiced grace and standing quietly during the ceremony, but I felt disconnected from the emotional significance of the event. What struck me most powerfully during the reception was observing the guest list composition. David's children, Tyler and Sophia, had flown in from San Diego with their mother for the wedding. They moved through the crowd with easy familiarity, greeting David's business associates and their children with the confidence of people who belonged in this social stratum. Meanwhile, my father's absence, he had not been invited, and the limited representation from my mother's side of the family created a subtle but unmistakable message about whose relationships and history were considered valuable in this new family structure. Moving to Paradise Valley. 2 weeks after the wedding, we moved from our modest 3-bedroom house in central Phoenix to David's sprawling estate in Paradise Valley. The transition was presented as an exciting adventure, an opportunity for me to have my own larger bedroom, access to the swimming pool, and proximity to better schools. The practical benefits were undeniable, but the emotional adjustment proved more complex than anyone anticipated. Our former house had been filled with evidence of our family history: photo albums chronicling my childhood, artwork I had created over the years, furniture that held memories of family movie nights, and homework sessions. David's house, while beautiful, felt like a museum where I was a guest rather than a resident. The walls displayed expensive art rather than family photos, and the common areas were arranged for entertaining rather than daily family life. My new bedroom was larger than any space I had ever inhabited, with its own bathroom, walk-in closet, and windows overlooking the professionally maintained backyard. Despite these luxurious amenities, the room felt cold and impersonal compared to my previous space, which had been gradually decorated with my collections, artwork, and possessions that reflected my interests and personality. The adjustment period was marked small but significant conflicts over household rules and expectations. David's standards for cleanliness and organization far exceeded what I had experienced in our previous home. Leaving shoes in common areas, forgetting to rinse dishes immediately after use, or playing music at volumes that might disturb others became sources of gentle but consistent correction. While David was never harsh in his guidance, the constant awareness of falling short of his expectations created a persistent underlying anxiety. More challenging was the shift in family dynamics. In our previous home, Mom and I had developed comfortable routines around homework time, weekend activities, and daily conversations that reflected our close relationship. In David's house, these intimate moments became less frequent as my mother adapted to her new role as wife to a successful businessman and stepmother to Tyler and Sophia during their visits. The school situation. The question of my education became a defining issue during my first year in the blended family. Tyler and Sophia attended Pinnacle Preparatory Academy, an exclusive private school in Scottsdale, known for its rigorous academic program, small class sizes, and impressive college placement record. The annual tuition was more than my father earned in 6 months, and the social environment catered to children from Phoenix's most affluent families. When I expressed interest in attending Pinnacle to be with my step-siblings, David's response was measured but ultimately dismissive. He explained that the school had a lengthy waiting list, that mid-year transfers were rarely accepted, and that my current public school was perfectly adequate for my educational needs. While these explanations were technically accurate, I sensed that the underlying issue was more complex than simple logistics. The truth, which I wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that my attendance at Pinnacle would have complicated David's carefully constructed family narrative. Tyler and Sophia represented his success and social status within the school community, where parents were evaluated based on their professional achievements and financial resources. My presence as the stepdaughter of more modest origins would have required explanations and acknowledgments of David's blended family situation that he preferred to minimize. Instead, I remained at Desert Vista High School, a well-regarded public school that nonetheless lacked the prestige and resources of Pinnacle Prep. The contrast became particularly apparent during family conversations about academic achievements, extracurricular activities, and college planning. Tyler's lacrosse tournaments and Sophia's gymnastics competitions were significant events that commanded family attention and celebration, while my honor roll achievements and debate team victories were acknowledged with polite praise but little enthusiasm. The transportation logistics further emphasized my peripheral status in the family structure. Tyler and Sophia were driven to and from Pinnacle in David's luxury vehicles, their schedules seamlessly integrated into the family's daily routines. My school schedule required separate planning and coordination, often involving my father picking me up for my weekend visits, or David making special trips that were clearly inconvenient for his preferred schedule. The financial disparities. As I entered my teenage years, the economic differences within our blended family became increasingly apparent and psychologically challenging. Tyler and Sophia's clothing, recreational activities, and general lifestyle reflected unlimited financial resources, while my own expenses were subject to informal but consistent limitations that highlighted my different status within the household. The most glaring example was the car situation when we each turned 16. Tyler received a new BMW convertible for his birthday, presented with great ceremony and extensive documentation for social media posts. The car was sleek, expensive, and perfectly suited to his image as a successful lacrosse player from an affluent family. 6 months later, Sophia received an identical vehicle in a different color, with similar fanfare and family celebration. When my 16th birthday arrived, I was presented with a gas card and told that I could share my father's aging Honda Civic during my weekend visits. The practical reasoning was sound. I didn't need a car during the weekdays when I was in school, but the symbolic message was unmistakable. Tyler and Sophia were investments worthy of significant financial commitment, while I was a temporary resident whose needs deserved minimal consideration. College planning discussions revealed even starker disparities. David had established education funds for Tyler and Sophia that would cover their full tuition, room and board, and additional expenses at whatever universities they chose to attend. These funds had been growing through careful investment for years, representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in educational security. When I raised questions about college funding during a family dinner, David's response was polite but essentially dismissive. He suggested that I explore merit scholarships, student loans, and other forms of financial aid available to motivated students. The implication was clear. Tyler and Sophia's education was a family priority, while my education was a personal responsibility. My mother's silence during these conversations was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire dynamic. The woman who had once prioritized my needs and advocated for my interests had become complicit in a system that systematically undervalued my place in the family. Her transformation from protective single mother to accommodating stepmother felt like a fundamental betrayal, though I lacked the emotional vocabulary to articulate this feeling at the time. The social media erasure. The gradual exclusion from family documentation became increasingly obvious through David's social media presence. His Instagram and Facebook accounts served as digital portfolios of his success, featuring professional photos of family vacations, milestone celebrations, and social events that positioned him as a prosperous businessman with a beautiful family. The pattern of my exclusion was subtle but consistent. Family vacation photos showed David, my mother, Tyler, and Sophia at ski resorts, beach destinations, and cultural attractions, presented as a happy family of four enjoying the benefits of financial success. When I appeared in these images, it was usually as a background figure or in group shots where my presence could be easily overlooked. More revealing were the Christmas card photos that David sent to his business associates and social contacts each year. These professionally staged images were carefully composed to project an image of family harmony and prosperity. Year after year, the photos featured the four core family members in coordinated outfits, positioned in aesthetically pleasing arrangements that told a story of conventional family success. I was never included in these images, despite living in the same household and being technically part of the family unit. The comments on these social media posts consistently praised David's beautiful family and lucky kids, reinforcing the narrative that Tyler and Sophia were his children, while I remained invisible. Friends and business associates who had met me at family gatherings somehow never thought to ask about my absence from these public family representations, suggesting that my peripheral status was apparent even to casual observers. During my sophomore year of high school, I began documenting this pattern of exclusion by screenshotting David's social media posts and comparing them to the reality of our family activities. The evidence was overwhelming. I had been systematically erased from the official narrative of our family life, relegated to the status of temporary visitor rather than permanent family member. The overheard conversations. The first concrete evidence of David's intentions came through a conversation I accidentally overheard during the spring of my junior year. I had returned home early from school due to a teacher development day and was surprised to find David in his home office, engaged in what sounded like a business call. His office door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried clearly down the hallway as I headed toward the kitchen. "The situation needs to be resolved before Tyler graduates," he was saying, his tone carrying the authority and precision he used in business discussions. "Having her around complicates the narrative we're building. Potential business partners and social connections see the inconsistency in our family structure." I froze in the hallway, my blood running cold as I realized he was discussing me. The clinical language, the situation, inconsistency, reduced my existence to a problem requiring management rather than a family member deserving consideration. "Sandra agrees it's for the best," David continued, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized my mother was complicit in whatever plan they were developing. "She's become too comfortable with the current arrangement, and it's time for her to focus exclusively on her biological father's household. The timing will work perfectly with our summer plans." I crept closer to the door, desperate to understand the full scope of their intentions, while terrified of what I might learn. "The transition needs to appear voluntary on her part," David was saying. "Any suggestion of coercion or abandonment could create legal complications, particularly given the child support situation. If we can present this as her choice to live with her father full-time, it eliminates potential problems down the road." The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering logistics and timelines that made clear they had been planning my removal for months. David discussed consolidating family resources, optimizing social presentation, and eliminating complications in language that made me feel like a business liability rather than a human being. That night, lying in my beautiful but cold bedroom, I struggled to process the implications of what I had heard. The family I had been trying so hard to fit into for the past 6 years had been actively planning to remove me from their lives. Every kindness, every inclusion, every moment of apparent acceptance had been temporary accommodations, while they developed their long-term strategy for my elimination. The document discovery. 2 weeks after overhearing David's phone conversation, an opportunity for investigation presented itself when both my mother and David were out of the house. Mom was attending her monthly book club meeting, and David was traveling to Tucson for a business conference. Tyler and Sophia were spending the weekend with friends, leaving me alone in the house for the first time in months. I had been mentally rehearsing this moment since the phone call, planning how I would search David's office for evidence of their plans without leaving any trace of my investigation. His office was normally off limits to me, a sacred space where he conducted business and managed the family's financial affairs. The few times I had been inside were for brief, supervised visits when he needed to retrieve something while I was present. The office itself reflected David's personality, meticulously organized, professionally decorated, and designed to impress visitors with evidence of his success. Awards and certificates covered one wall, while another featured photos of David with various civic leaders and business associates. His mahogany desk was positioned to command the room, with carefully arranged documents and high-end office equipment that spoke to both wealth and efficiency. I began my search systematically, starting with the filing cabinets that lined one wall of the office. Most folders contained business documents, tax records, and investment portfolios that meant little to me. But in the bottom drawer of the largest cabinet, I found a folder labeled Family Planning that made my heart race with anticipation and dread. The contents of this folder exceeded my worst fears. The first document was a detailed timeline spanning the next 8 months, with my name appearing in what could only be described as a removal plan. The document outlined specific steps: initiate conversations about Jessica's preferences, establish pattern of voluntary statements, coordinate with Sandra on transition messaging, and finalize arrangements before summer vacation period. Deeper in the folder, I found draft letters that David had prepared for various scenarios. One was addressed to my father, explaining that I had expressed a desire to live with him full-time and requesting his cooperation in modifying the custody arrangement. Another was addressed to my school, notifying them of my planned transfer to a different district. A third was addressed to our family attorney, requesting guidance on legal procedures for voluntary custody modifications. But the most shocking discovery was near the bottom of the folder: a petition for voluntary termination of parental rights, with my mother's signature already affixed and dated just 4 days earlier. The document was prepared by a family law attorney I had never heard of, complete with legal justifications that painted my mother's decision as being in my best interests and motivated by a desire to provide me with stability and consistency in my father's household. The language was carefully crafted to suggest that this decision had emerged from thoughtful consideration of my needs, rather than David's desire to eliminate me from his family narrative. References to my strong bond with her biological father and expressed preferences for spending time in that household created a fictional history of statements I had never made and feelings I had never expressed. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands shaking, as I documented the evidence of their comprehensive plan to erase me from their lives. The thoroughness of their preparation was overwhelming. They had anticipated every potential complication and prepared responses for every possible objection. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a temporary arrangement. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to permanently remove me from their family structure. The emotional reckoning. The weekend following my discovery of the documents was among the darkest periods of my teenage years. I spent hours in my room, alternating between rage and despair as I processed the full scope of my family's betrayal. The woman who had given birth to me, who had once prioritized my needs above her own comfort, had signed legal documents to abandon me in service of her new husband's social aspirations. The isolation was complete and devastating. I couldn't discuss this discovery with friends at school, partly because the situation was too complex and painful to explain, and partly because I feared their pity or judgment. The idea of calling my father felt overwhelming. How could I explain that my mother was trying to legally abandon me without destroying his faith in humanity or his ability to co-parent effectively? Sleep became elusive as my mind cycled through questions that had no satisfactory answers. How long had they been planning this? Had any of the kindness I had received over the years been genuine, or had it all been performance designed to maintain peace until they could execute their plan? What would happen to me if my father refused to cooperate with their scheme? The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate crisis. Years of feeling like an outsider in my mother's new family suddenly made perfect sense. I had been an outsider, tolerated temporarily, but never truly accepted. Every instance of exclusion, every casual dismissal of my needs, every moment when I had blamed myself for not fitting in could now be understood as evidence of their long-term intentions. The betrayal felt multi-layered and complete. My mother had violated the most fundamental obligation of parenthood by prioritizing her husband's comfort over her child's well-being. David had manipulated family dynamics for years, creating an environment where my removal would seem natural rather than cruel. Even Tyler and Sophia, though not directly involved in the planning, had been complicit in maintaining a family culture where my marginalization was normalized and accepted. Reaching out to my father. After 3 days of internal struggle, I finally gathered the courage to call my father. The conversation was among the most difficult of my life, requiring me to explain not just the immediate crisis, but years of gradual exclusion that had led to this moment. Dad listened with the patient attention he had always shown, asking clarifying questions, but never interrupting my emotional recounting of events. His initial reaction was pure rage, though he controlled his anger carefully to avoid adding to my distress. "Your mother can't just decide to terminate her rights because her new husband finds you inconvenient," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You're not a business asset to be disposed of when you become problematic." The legal realities, he explained, were more complex than David and my mother seemed to understand. Terminating parental rights requires either the consent of both biological parents or a court order based on abandonment, neglect, or unfitness. As long as my father refused to cooperate, which he absolutely would, their plan was legally impossible to execute. But Dad also recognized that the emotional damage was already severe, and that remaining in an environment where I was actively unwanted would be psychologically devastating, regardless of the legal outcomes. "We need to develop our own strategy," he told me, "one that protects you while exposing their manipulation for what it really is." Over the following week, we met several times to plan our response. Dad had consulted with a family law attorney who confirmed that the documents I had discovered were essentially worthless without his cooperation. But we decided to let their plan proceed publicly while secretly preparing our own counteraction. The strategy was both simple and satisfying. We would allow David and my mother to reveal the full extent of their callousness while simultaneously documenting their behavior for potential legal action. If they wanted me gone badly enough to plan such an elaborate scheme, we would grant their wish in a way that made their motivations undeniably clear. Playing the part. Implementing our strategy required me to become an actress in my own life, performing the role of a teenager gradually coming to prefer my father's household over my mother's. The performance was emotionally exhausting, but strategically necessary, creating a paper trail of statements that would later demonstrate how David and my mother had manipulated me into expressing preferences that served their agenda. I began making casual comments about enjoying my time at Dad's apartment, mentioning how relaxed I felt there compared to the pressure of maintaining perfect behavior in David's house. These statements were carefully crafted to seem spontaneous while actually building evidence of the emotional environment that had been created to encourage my departure. My mother's response to these comments was telling. Rather than expressing concern about my apparent unhappiness or working to address the underlying issues, she seized on every statement as validation of their plan. "It's so wonderful that you feel comfortable with your father," she would say, her relief barely concealed behind maternal concern. David's participation in these conversations was more subtle but equally revealing. He would nod approvingly when I mentioned preferring the simpler lifestyle at my father's apartment or the less complicated social dynamics there. His questions were designed to encourage elaboration on my supposed preferences while never directly suggesting that I should live there permanently. The most challenging aspect of this performance was maintaining the charade during family interactions that would have been genuinely pleasant under different circumstances. Sharing meals, watching movies, or participating in household activities required me to suppress my knowledge of their true intentions while behaving naturally enough to avoid suspicion. The Hawaii vacation announcement. 6 weeks before the end of my junior year, David announced plans for a family vacation to Hawaii during the summer break. The timing was perfect, he explained, because Tyler would be graduating from high school and Sophia had qualified for a national gymnastics competition that would take place in Honolulu. The family could combine celebration with competition while enjoying a luxury resort experience. The vacation planning process revealed the full extent of my exclusion from their family vision. Conversations about resort accommodations, dining reservations, and activity planning proceeded as if I didn't exist. When I finally asked directly about my inclusion in the trip, the response was carefully choreographed evasion. "We're still working out the details," my mother said, exchanging a glance with David that I was clearly meant to notice. "There are some scheduling complications we need to resolve." David's explanation was more elaborate but equally transparent. The resort has limited availability, and Tyler's graduation celebration needs to be the priority. Plus, Sophia's competition schedule might make it difficult to plan activities that would be interesting for everyone. The subtext was clear. This vacation was designed for the real family, and my presence would complicate both the logistics and the emotional dynamics they wanted to create. This wasn't about scheduling or resort availability. It was about creating memories and family experiences that would exclude me entirely. I played my part perfectly, expressing disappointment but understanding. "Maybe I could spend that time with Dad," I suggested, as if the idea had just occurred to me. "We've been talking about taking a trip together, and this might be perfect timing." The relief in both my mother's and David's expressions was unmistakable. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Mom said with excessive enthusiasm. "You and your father could have such a special time together." The pre-departure manipulation. The week before their scheduled departure for Hawaii, my mother's behavior became increasingly focused on finalizing what she believed was our mutual agreement about my living arrangements. Her approach was sophisticated, designed to create the appearance of maternal concern while actually securing my cooperation in their removal plan. "I've been thinking about what you said about feeling more comfortable at your father's place," she began during one of our evening conversations. "Maybe it would be better for everyone if you stayed there while we're in Hawaii. It would give you and your dad some uninterrupted time together. The suggestion was presented as temporary and experimental, but I recognized it as the first step in their permanent removal strategy. That sounds nice, I replied, maintaining my performance of gradual enthusiasm for increased time with my father. Actually, Mom continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone working through a complex problem, I wonder if it might make sense for you to move some of your things over there before we leave, just to make the transition easier and give you a chance to settle in properly. This was exactly what my father and I had anticipated. They wanted me to voluntarily relocate my belongings, creating the appearance that I had chosen to move out rather than being forced to leave. I think that's a great idea, I said, hiding my disgust behind manufactured excitement. The final pieces of their plan became clear during a family dinner 3 days before their departure. David, speaking with the authority of someone making a reasonable practical decision, suggested that I should consider making the living arrangement with my father permanent. It seems like that's what would make you happiest, he said, his tone suggesting paternal wisdom rather than calculated manipulation, and it would eliminate all the back and forth that seems to be causing stress for everyone. My mother nodded in agreement, her expression portraying maternal sacrifice rather than selfish ambition. We just want what's best for you, sweetie. If that means spending more time with your dad, then that's what we should do. The performance was masterful in its combination of false concern and manufactured reasonableness. Anyone observing the conversation without knowing the background would have seen caring parents putting their child's needs first. Only I knew that this apparent selflessness was actually the culmination of months of planning designed to eliminate me from their lives. The departure day. The morning of their departure to Hawaii arrived with the artificial cheerfulness that characterizes forced family moments. Tyler and Sophia were genuinely excited about the vacation, discussing snorkeling plans and restaurant reservations with the enthusiasm of teenagers anticipating a luxury experience. My mother and David maintained their performance of regretful necessity, expressing wishes that I could join them while emphasizing how much I would enjoy my extended time with my father. I played my part perfectly, hugging them goodbye with apparent warmth while secretly documenting the moment with my phone's voice recorder. Their final words to me were carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative they had constructed. Have a wonderful time with your dad, my mother said, her embrace feeling hollow and performative. This is going to be so good for both of you. David's farewell was brief but symbolically significant. Take care, Jessica. I hope you find exactly what you're looking for. The phrase would later prove prophetic, though not in the way he intended. As their airport shuttle pulled away from the house, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Grief for the family relationship that had never been as real as I had hoped, anger at the calculated cruelty of their manipulation, and anticipation for the reckoning that was about to unfold. Within an hour of their departure, my father arrived with a moving truck and 3 of his closest friends. We had 10 days to execute our plan before their return, and every detail had been carefully prepared to maximize both practical efficiency and symbolic impact. The systematic erasure. Our operation began immediately and proceeded with military precision. The goal was not simply to remove my belongings, but to eliminate every trace of my existence from the house while preserving everything for my future. Every photograph, document, artwork, and personal item that connected me to this family would be carefully cataloged and stored, creating a comprehensive record of my presence that contradicted their desired narrative of voluntary departure. The photograph removal process was particularly methodical. We went through every album, every framed picture, and every casual snapshot displayed throughout the house, extracting any image that included me. Family vacation photos from years past, Christmas morning celebrations, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, all were carefully removed and replaced with pictures that showed only David, my mother, Tyler, and Sophia. The transformation was startling in its completeness. Walls that had displayed 6 years of blended family memories now showed only the sanitized version of their preferred family structure. The refrigerator, once covered with my artwork alongside Tyler's lacrosse schedules and Sophia's gymnastics achievements, was stripped of any evidence of my creative efforts or academic accomplishments. My former bedroom received the most dramatic treatment. We removed not just my belongings, but every trace of my personality and presence. The walls were repainted from the soft lavender I had chosen to a neutral beige that suggested a generic guest room rather than a space where someone had lived for years. Furniture was rearranged to create an entirely different layout, and new decorative elements were added to establish a completely different atmosphere. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. When David and my mother returned from Hawaii, they would find exactly what they had always wanted: a house that reflected their vision of family, without any inconvenient reminders of the child they had systematically excluded and ultimately abandoned. But our operation extended beyond simple removal and redecoration. My father had hired a private investigator months earlier, and the information we had gathered about David's business practices was both extensive and damaging. The investigator had documented a pattern of fraudulent behavior in his real estate dealings, including forged signatures on contracts, concealed liens on properties sold to unsuspecting buyers, and systematic tax evasion that had been ongoing for years. The business fraud investigation. The private investigator's report read like a comprehensive indictment of David's entire professional operation. Over the course of nearly a decade, he had been systematically defrauding clients, business partners, and government agencies through a sophisticated network of shell companies and falsified documents. The most serious charges involved his luxury residential developments, where he had been selling properties with hidden liens and undisclosed structural problems. Buyers who thought they were purchasing dream homes in Paradise Valley and Scottsdale had actually acquired properties with massive hidden debts and construction defects that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to resolve. David's method was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. He would purchase distressed properties through shell companies, perform minimal renovations that concealed major structural issues, then sell them to wealthy buyers who trusted his reputation without conducting thorough, independent inspections. The buyers would discover the problems months or years later, long after David had moved the money offshore and dissolved the shell companies that had legal responsibility for the transactions. Tax evasion was another major component of his fraudulent operation. By routing income through multiple business entities and claiming fraudulent deductions for personal expenses, David had avoided paying federal and state taxes on millions of dollars of income over the past 7 years. The paper trail was complex but ultimately traceable, thanks to the investigator's forensic accounting expertise. The investigator had also uncovered evidence of bribery involving local building inspectors and zoning officials. David had been making regular payments to ensure that his developments received favorable treatment during the approval process, often allowing him to build luxury homes that violated environmental regulations and building codes. We compiled all of this information into a comprehensive dossier that included financial records, witness statements, photographs of construction defects, and documentation of the bribery schemes. The evidence was overwhelming and would be impossible for David to dismiss or explain away. The timing of our release was carefully planned to maximize impact. We sent copies of the dossier to the Arizona Department of Real Estate, the FBI's White Collar Crime Division, the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, and 3 major local news outlets known for investigative reporting. The releases were scheduled to arrive on the 3rd day of their Hawaii vacation, ensuring that David would be unable to control the initial narrative or manage the crisis effectively. The media storm. The story broke on Tuesday morning while David and my family were snorkeling in Maui, completely unaware that their lives were imploding back in Phoenix. The Arizona Republic ran the story on their front page with the headline, "Paradise Valley Developer Accused of Decade-Long Fraud Scheme," accompanied by photographs of David and detailed allegations from former clients. The investigation quickly gained momentum as other media outlets picked up the story and began conducting their own research into David's business practices. Local television stations featured nightly reports on the scandal, interviewing angry clients who had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to David's fraudulent schemes. Social media amplified the story exponentially, with Facebook groups and community forums sharing experiences with David's company and warning others about potential fraud. The hashtag #ChenFraud began trending locally, and David's carefully cultivated reputation as a successful businessman and community leader evaporated within 48 hours. The regulatory response was swift and comprehensive. The Arizona Department of Real Estate immediately suspended David's license and launched a formal investigation into his business practices. The FBI announced that they were opening a criminal investigation into allegations of wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The IRS began procedures to freeze David's assets pending their own investigation into tax evasion charges. By Thursday morning, local television crews were stationed outside David's Paradise Valley house, waiting for the family's return from Hawaii and hoping for comments about the growing scandal. Neighbors reported being contacted by reporters seeking information about David's character and business practices. The story had grown beyond a simple fraud investigation to become a broader narrative about wealth, corruption, and the hidden costs of luxury development in Phoenix's most exclusive neighborhoods. David had become the symbol of everything wrong with unchecked development and the exploitation of regulatory systems by wealthy developers. The return from paradise. My family's flight landed at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport on Friday afternoon, returning them to a reality that bore no resemblance to the paradise they had left behind. The first indication that something was wrong came when David's phone began buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and angry clients as soon as they turned off airplane mode. My mother called me within 3 hours of their landing, her voice carrying a combination of confusion and rising panic that I had never heard before. "Jessica, I'm at the house and something's wrong. Your things aren't here. Did you already move everything to your father's?" I was prepared for this call and responded with the perfect mixture of surprise and defensiveness. "Yes, Mom. I thought that's what you wanted. You said it would be better for everyone if I stayed with Dad full-time." "Well, yes, but everything is gone. All your photos, your school things, your artwork from when you were little. It's like you were never here. Isn't that better for everyone?" I asked, echoing the reasoning she had used to justify my removal. "Now you can have the family dynamic you really wanted. No complications, no inconsistencies in your narrative." There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice smaller and more uncertain. Can we talk about this? Can you come over? There are other things happening, and I think we need to discuss everything as a family. I don't think that's my home anymore, Mom. Remember? You signed papers to terminate your parental rights. I think that makes our relationship pretty clear. The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. She was clearly processing the implications of my knowledge about their secret plan, while also trying to understand how I had learned about the legal documents. Where did you hear about that? I found the papers in David's office, Mom. The whole plan, the timeline, the strategy to make it look like my choice. I know everything. The confrontation at the apartment. 2 days after their return from Hawaii, my mother appeared at my father's apartment building, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her demeanor desperate in a way I had never witnessed. The concierge called up to announce her arrival, describing her as very upset and insisting that she needed to speak with Jessica immediately. I agreed to meet her in the building's lobby, a neutral location with witnesses present and security cameras recording our interaction. My father offered to accompany me, but I felt this conversation needed to happen between my mother and me alone, at least initially. She looked like she had aged years in the past week. Her usually immaculate hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup was smudged around her eyes from crying, and her hands shook visibly as she clutched her purse. The designer clothes that had become her uniform since marrying David were wrinkled and ill-fitting, as if she had grabbed whatever was closest without considering her appearance. Jessica, please, she began before I'd even fully sat down in the lobby chair across from her. I need you to tell me what you know about David's investigation. Are you involved in this somehow? I met her eyes directly, seeing desperation and fear that was both satisfying and heartbreaking. I know that he's been committing fraud for years, and someone finally reported him to the authorities. Were you the one who reported him? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about my capability for strategic thinking and my willingness to destroy the family structure that had excluded me. I could see her mental calculations as she tried to reconcile the image of me as a passive teenager with the possibility that I had orchestrated David's downfall. David tried to erase me from your family, I said, avoiding a direct answer while making my motivations clear. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for that kind of cruelty? She sank deeper into the lobby chair, her composure crumbling entirely. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought it would be easier for everyone if you focused on your relationship with your father. You two have such a special bond. You mean it would be easier for you to pretend I never existed, I corrected. Easier for David to present his perfect family without any complications or inconsistencies. That's not fair, Jessica. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? You signed papers to terminate your parental rights, Mom. You were planning to legally abandon me so David could have his ideal family image for his business associates. The accusation landed with visible impact, and she started crying in earnest then, mascara running down her cheeks as years of suppressed guilt finally surfaced. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. David said it was becoming a problem, having you around sometimes but not others. His business associates were asking questions about our family dynamic, why some events included you and others didn't. He said it was affecting his reputation. So you chose his business reputation over your daughter. I chose financial security, she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she had been rehearsing this justification. Do you have any idea what it's like to worry about money constantly? To wonder if you'll be able to pay rent or buy groceries? David offered stability, a future for all of us. He offered stability for Tyler and Sophia, I corrected. I was never part of his future plans, and you knew that from the beginning. She was quiet for a long moment, processing the accuracy of my statement. I told myself you'd be better off with your father anyway, that you two had a stronger connection, and I was just in the way of that relationship. That's a convenient rationalization, but we both know it's not true. You abandoned me because keeping me would have been inconvenient for your new husband. The revelation of David's downfall. As we sat in that lobby, my mother's phone began buzzing with increasing frequency. Each call seemed to bring worse news about David's legal situation, and I watched her face grow paler with each conversation. That was our attorney, she said after ending one particularly long call. David's been indicted on 12 felony counts. Wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering. They're saying he could face 25 years in federal prison. The magnitude of David's crimes was becoming clear, and with it, the complete collapse of the lifestyle that had motivated my mother's betrayal. Everything she had sacrificed our relationship to obtain was disappearing in real time. They've frozen all our assets, she continued, her voice hollow with shock. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, Tyler's college fund, Sophia's training expenses. Everything is gone pending the investigation. I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sympathy, watching her process the destruction of her carefully constructed life. The security she had prioritized over her relationship with me had proven to be an illusion built on criminal activity. Where will you live? I asked, genuinely curious about her practical situation. I don't know. The house will probably be seized as part of the asset forfeiture. I have maybe $3,000 in my personal checking account, and my job at the dermatology office barely covers basic expenses. The irony was profound. In choosing David's wealth over our relationship, she had ultimately lost both the money and her daughter. The financial security that had seemed so important had evaporated, leaving her alone and facing the same economic uncertainty she had tried so desperately to avoid. "What about Tyler and Sophia?" I asked. "Tyler can't start USC in the fall. We can't afford the tuition, and his dorm deposit was paid with funds that are now frozen. Sophia's gymnastics training is finished. We can't pay for coaching or competition fees." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "They're devastated. Their whole futures were planned around David's money, and now everything has to be reconsidered." I felt genuine sympathy for my step-siblings, who had been innocent victims of their father's criminal behavior. Unlike the calculated cruelty David and my mother had shown me, Tyler and Sophia's suffering was the result of circumstances beyond their control. The aftermath for the Chen family. Over the following weeks, the full scope of David's legal troubles became clear, and with it, the complete dismantling of the family structure that had excluded me. Tyler, who had been destined for USC with plans to study business and eventually join David's real estate empire, found himself scrambling to find alternatives for his education and career. The athletic scholarship that had covered part of his USC expenses was no longer sufficient to make the education affordable without David's financial support. Tyler ultimately enrolled at Phoenix Community College, planning to complete his general education requirements while working part-time to save money for a transfer to a four-year university. The psychological impact on Tyler was significant. His identity had been built around being the successful son of a wealthy businessman, destined for privilege and social status that his father's money could provide. Suddenly finding himself in the same economic situation as most of his peers, dependent on financial aid, student loans, and part-time employment, required a fundamental reassessment of his self-concept and future plans. Sophia's situation was equally dramatic. Her gymnastics career, which had required expensive coaching, travel to competitions, and specialized training facilities, came to an abrupt end when the family could no longer afford the costs. Years of training and dreams of Olympic competition disappeared overnight, replaced by the necessity of finding more affordable activities and reconsidering her entire life trajectory. The social implications were perhaps as challenging as the financial ones. Tyler and Sophia had to transfer from Pinnacle Prep to public schools for their final years of high school, leaving behind the social network that had defined their teenage years. The children who had once been at the center of Phoenix's most exclusive social circles found themselves starting over in environments where their previous status meant nothing. My mother's adjustment to this new reality was equally dramatic. The Paradise Valley house was indeed seized as part of the federal asset forfeiture, forcing her to move into a modest two-bedroom apartment in Tempe. The designer clothes, luxury cars, and expensive lifestyle accessories that had defined her identity for 6 years were either sold to pay legal fees or simply abandoned as impractical for her new circumstances. The legal proceedings. David's trial became one of the most closely watched white-collar crime cases in Arizona's recent history. The evidence against him was overwhelming, compiled not just from our investigation, but from years of complaints from defrauded clients that had finally been taken seriously by federal prosecutors. The prosecution painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade, with David using his reputation and social connections to gain the trust of victims before exploiting that trust for financial gain. Witness after witness testified about hidden liens, concealed structural problems, and fraudulent business practices that had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. David's defense strategy focused on portraying him as a successful businessman who had made some poor decisions under financial pressure, rather than a criminal who had systematically defrauded clients for years. His attorneys argued that many of the problems with his developments were the result of subcontractor failures, rather than intentional fraud, and that he had always intended to make good on his obligations to clients. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 12 felony counts. David was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $8 million to his victims. The judge specifically noted the systematic and callous nature of David's crimes, emphasizing that he had used his position of trust in the community to exploit vulnerable clients. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed the criminal trial were equally comprehensive. Every property, vehicle, and financial account connected to David's fraudulent activities was seized and liquidated to provide restitution to his victims. Tyler and Sophia's college funds, which had been built partially with proceeds from fraudulent activities, were included in the forfeiture despite their innocence in their father's crimes. My mother's reckoning. In the months following David's conviction, my mother and I began the slow and difficult process of rebuilding some form of relationship. The conversations were painful and often frustrating, as she struggled to understand the full scope of the damage her choices had caused, while I worked to process years of accumulated hurt and abandonment. The first serious conversation took place 3 months after David's sentencing, when she called to ask if we could meet for coffee. Her voice on the phone was different, smaller, more uncertain, lacking the confident tone that had characterized her communication during the David years. We met at a modest coffee shop in Tempe, near her new apartment. The contrast with our previous meetings in upscale Scottsdale restaurants was stark and symbolic. She arrived on time, but looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse and avoiding eye contact as she ordered a simple coffee instead of the elaborate specialty drinks she had favored during her wealthier period. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About choosing David's reputation over you. I think you were right, and I need to understand how I could have done something so terrible to my own daughter." This acknowledgement was the first step toward any possibility of reconciliation, but it was only the beginning of a much longer process. "I need to understand too, Mom. I need to understand how the woman who used to prioritize my needs above everything else could sign papers to legally abandon me." "I was scared," she said simply. "After your father and I divorced, I was terrified of ending up alone and poor. When David came along with his money and security, I convinced myself that keeping his approval was the most important thing I could do for our future. But I was part of that future too. Or at least, I should have been." "You're right. I told myself I was protecting you by giving you stability with your father, but I was really protecting myself from having to choose between David's demands and your needs." The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with both of us working to understand how our relationship had deteriorated to the point where she could consider abandoning me entirely. It wasn't a single conversation that resolved everything, but rather the beginning of a series of discussions that would continue for years. The therapy process. My mother and I ultimately entered family therapy together, working with Dr. Rachel Morrison, a specialist in family reunification after trauma and abandonment. The sessions were initially uncomfortable and often contentious, as we worked through years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Dr. Morrison helped us establish ground rules for our conversations that prevented the defensive spirals that had characterized our previous attempts at communication. My mother had to acknowledge the specific ways her actions had harmed me without trying to justify or minimize the damage. I had to work on expressing my anger and hurt without using them as weapons to punish her ongoing attempts at reconciliation. "Sandra," Dr. Morrison said during one particularly difficult session, "you need to understand that Jessica's anger isn't something she needs to get over quickly so you can feel better about your choices. Her anger is legitimate and protective, and she has every right to hold on to it until she's ready to let it go." The therapy process revealed the depth of my mother's own insecurities and the ways her childhood experiences had shaped her desperate need for financial security. She had grown up in poverty, watching her own mother struggle as a single parent, and had developed a deep fear of economic vulnerability that overrode her maternal instincts when David demanded my removal. I convinced myself that ensuring our financial stability was the most loving thing I could do, she explained during one session. "I thought that having a secure home and access to David's resources was more important than anything else I could give you." "But those resources were never really available to me," I pointed out. "David made it clear from the beginning that Tyler and Sophia were his priority, and I was just someone he tolerated for your sake." "You're right. I chose to ignore that because acknowledging it would have meant giving up the security I thought we needed." The rebuilding process. Slowly, over the course of nearly 2 years, my mother and I began to rebuild a relationship based on honesty, rather than the performance that had characterized our interactions during the David years. It wasn't the mother-daughter relationship we had once had, but it was something genuine and sustainable. She found work as an office manager at a small accounting firm, earning enough to support herself modestly while living in her Tempe apartment. The work was honest and stable, providing the kind of genuine security that David's criminal empire never could have offered long-term. Tyler and Sophia both reached out to me during this period, acknowledging the ways they had been complicit in my exclusion and expressing genuine remorse for their behavior. Tyler, who was working construction while attending community college, seemed to have gained perspective on privilege and entitlement through his own experience of economic hardship. "I always knew it wasn't fair how you were treated," he told me during one of our conversations. "But I was too comfortable with the benefits of Dad's money to say anything. I'm sorry for being such a coward." Sophia's apology was similarly thoughtful and specific. "I was jealous of your relationship with your father," she admitted. "You always seemed like you had someone who really loved you unconditionally, while Dad's love felt like it came with conditions and expectations. I should have been happy for you instead of contributing to your exclusion." These acknowledgments didn't erase the years of hurt, but they did help me understand that Tyler and Sophia had been children too, navigating a complex family dynamic created by the adults in their lives. College and independence. With my father's support and the merit scholarships I earned through academic achievement, I was able to attend Arizona State University without any financial contribution from my mother or David's now non-existent resources. The experience of paying for my own education through scholarships, part-time work, and student loans gave me a sense of independence and self-reliance that proved invaluable. I majored in social work with a focus on family services, directly inspired by my own experience navigating complex family dynamics and parental abandonment. During college, I volunteered with organizations that supported children from divorced families and adolescents aging out of foster care, using my personal experience to provide credible guidance to others facing similar challenges. My academic work included research on parental alienation and the psychological impact of blended family dynamics on children. Writing papers about these topics helped me process my own experiences while contributing to professional knowledge that could help other families avoid similar destructive patterns. My mother attended my college graduation, sitting with my father in a display of cooperation that would have seemed impossible during the worst periods of our family crisis. She had learned to celebrate my achievements without trying to claim credit for them, and I had learned to appreciate her growth without forgetting the harm her previous choices had caused. Career and purpose. After graduation, I was hired by the Maricopa County Family Court as a family advocate, helping judges make custody and visitation decisions that prioritize children's needs over parental convenience. My personal experience with family manipulation and abandonment gave me unique insight into the dynamics that could harm children in contested custody situations. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply meaningful. I regularly encountered families where one parent was attempting to exclude or marginalize the other parent's relationship with their children, and I was able to identify these patterns quickly based on my own experience. In one particularly memorable case, I worked with a 14-year-old girl whose stepfather was pressuring her mother to limit the girl's contact with her biological father. The dynamics were eerily similar to what I had experienced with David, and I was able to help the family court recognize the manipulation before permanent damage was done to the parent-child relationship. "You saved my relationship with my daughter," the biological father told me after the court ruled in favor of continued shared custody. "I don't know how you knew what questions to ask, but you saw through their manipulation when no one else could." Marriage and starting my own family. When I married my college boyfriend, Marcus, 5 years after graduation, both of my parents walked me down the aisle together. It was an unconventional arrangement that reflected the unconventional journey our family had taken to reach that point. Marcus had been aware of my family history from early in our relationship, and his patient support during my healing process had been instrumental in my ability to trust and love openly again. His own family, while not perfect, provided a model of genuine care and inclusion that helped me understand what healthy family dynamics could look like. David had been released from federal prison 6 months before our wedding after serving 4.5 years of his sentence. He was not invited to the celebration, and I felt no regret about that decision. Some people demonstrate through consistent effort that they deserve second chances. Others serve as permanent reminders of lessons learned and boundaries that must be maintained. Tyler and Sophia both attended my wedding, having grown into thoughtful adults who understood the complexity of family relationships. Tyler had completed his degree in education and was working as a high school teacher while coaching lacrosse. Sophia had found success as a gymnastics instructor for young children, channeling her athletic experience into helping others develop confidence and discipline. The adversity their family had faced when David's crimes were exposed had ultimately made both of them more empathetic and grounded than they might have been if their privileged childhood had continued uninterrupted. Reflections on family and forgiveness. Looking back on this experience from the perspective of an adult with my own family, I understand that being systematically excluded from my mother's new family was both the most painful and most transformative experience of my life. It forced me to confront the difference between being tolerated and being truly valued, between fitting into someone else's vision and being loved for who I actually am. The attempt to erase me from their family narrative ultimately freed me from a dynamic that was slowly destroying my sense of self-worth. Sometimes what feels like devastating rejection is actually redirection towards something much better and more authentic. My relationship with my mother today is cordial and occasionally warm, built on mutual respect rather than biological obligation. She has learned to offer support without trying to control outcomes, and I have learned to appreciate her growth while maintaining healthy boundaries that protect my emotional well-being. My father remains my anchor and my model for what unconditional love looks like in practice. He never remarried, choosing instead to focus on building a life that prioritized authentic relationships over social expectations or financial advancement. The present day today, I work as a private practice therapist specializing in blended family dynamics and parental alienation. My own experience gives me credibility with clients who feel invisible or unwanted in their family situations, and I'm able to help them recognize manipulation and develop strategies for protecting their emotional well-being. My mother and I have coffee together once a month, maintaining a relationship that acknowledges our history without being defined by it. She has become a grandmother to my 2 children, though her role is carefully circumscribed by boundaries that we both understand and respect. The children I work with professionally often remind me of my teenage self, confused by mixed messages, desperate for acceptance, and uncertain whether their feelings of exclusion are valid or imagined. I'm able to validate their experiences while helping them develop the emotional tools they need to navigate complex family situations. The larger message. If you've ever felt like you don't belong in your own family, if you've been made to feel like your presence is an inconvenience or your needs are secondary to others' comfort, please know that your worth isn't determined by their failure to recognize it. Sometimes the family that's supposed to protect and nurture you becomes the source of your deepest wounds. When that happens, you have the right to step away, to find people who value you completely, and to build a life that reflects your actual worth, rather than their limited vision. The people who try to erase you from their story are simply revealing that they were never meant to be the main characters in yours. Your real family, biological or chosen, will never ask you to diminish yourself to make them comfortable. Family isn't about shared DNA or legal documents or living in the same house. It's about showing up consistently, especially when it's difficult. It's about choosing each other daily, not just when it's convenient. And it's about creating space for each person to be fully themselves, without apology or explanation. My stepfamily's attempt to delete me from their lives taught me that love isn't something you have to earn through perfect behavior or strategic self-presentation. Real love is given freely and maintained consistently, regardless of external circumstances or social pressures. If you're currently living in a family situation where you feel unseen, undervalued, or actively excluded, please know that your experiences are valid and your feelings matter. You deserve relationships where your presence is celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Thank you for reading my story. If it resonated with you, please share your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the first step toward healing and building the relationships we actually deserve. Remember, you belong somewhere, even if it's not where you started. Your worth isn't negotiable, and your story matters more than anyone's attempt to edit you out of theirs. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.